welcome back to A Mighty Fortress is Our Pod. Today's guest is Reverend Paul Shoup, a retired Lutheran pastor and pastoral counselor. Without further ado, my conversation with Reverend Paul Shoup. All right, so I am here with Pastor Paul Shoup, who is a graduate of Capital University and Evangelical Lutheran Theological Seminary. So, Pastor Shoup, thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
So I guess I'll just start with, what was your introduction to the church and the faith? What was your upbringing in the church like?
Well, I'm a preacher's kid.
Okay.
My dad graduated from the seminary in 1935, I think it was.
And that also was at ELTS?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
And he and my mother both went to Capital University. So I grew up in the church from the time I was conceived.
And then you ended up repeating the cycle then, I guess, when you went to Capital. Was that
Well,
always the plan, or?
no.
Okay.
My mother was graduated with a major in math in 1936. So the last thing in the world I was going to do was become a pastor growing up. And so I actually followed much more in my mother's footsteps, and I graduated with a major in math from Capital.
Okay. What were you planning on doing with that?
Well, I didn't know what to do with it. She was a teacher. I wasn't particularly wanting to become a teacher, and you met one of my high school buddies, John Neiman.
Yep.
John was from Woodville, and he and I did a whole bunch of Luther League stuff together in high school. And we had about 30 of us, I think, that went to Capital, that went right from Capital right across the street to the seminary. Those were my buddies. Those are the guys I ran around with. So I thought, well, I might as well go with them, because I really, by my, when I started my junior year at Cap, I thought, well, just to be safe, I'll take Greek. And languages came easy. Math and languages fit well together. So I started Greek and thought, okay, well, I'll do that just in case. And so all my buddies were going to go to Capital. So I decided, or to the seminary. So I said, well, I might as well do that too. So that's how I ended up deciding to go to the seminary.
You mentioned that you definitely did not see yourself doing that growing up. Why didn't you see yourself doing that? And what do you feel changed once you were there?
Good questions. Well, I saw my dad. My dad was a workaholic. He usually had 2 weeks vacation, and other than that, he took off 2 days the rest of the year, Labor Day and Memorial Day. But those were days that he would varnish or redo the church doors. I didn't see myself, and he was virtually always on call, and that seemed to be too much. My dad was really never available. He didn't really pressure me then. We had a conflict later about it, but I just saw him as his life was almost totally separate from the family.
So would you say then, once you got to seminary, maybe one thing that helped is you were able to see other ways of doing ministry?
No, I just kind of went with the flow. I got started. I didn't have any. I didn't see any other. I had really lost my interest in math. I went up through got a major in math, went up through calculus and differential equations and all that. I was not one of the best one in class. I got okay grades, but I lost interest in that. And what I really liked was people. So one of the things that I said to myself was, Paul, you can do that. You know how to do it. You've seen the pattern. You know how to do it. You might as well do it. There's nothing else to do. So then came time for internship. And when I was 15, my folks took a trip. And we took a trip to, my dad had a seminary classmate in Portland, Oregon. And we went there. I was a sophomore in high school. And we were out there in Portland and went to church at my dad's classmate's church in Portland. And I stood out on the outside looking at Mount Hood. And as a 15-year-old, I said, when I grow up, this is where I want to be. And so one of the things that was a really good fortune was I was assigned to internship in Portland. And to me, that was God's good favor to be assigned there. So I got to go out to Portland for a year. But then I came back and I said, oh my goodness, now what? So at that point, we were able to say when it came time for calls, what synod, then it was districts, because this was back in the old ALC days. I started when the old ALC merged with the ELC, which was when the Germans merged with the Norwegians back in 1960, 61. I started seminary in 60.
And the Germans were the old ALC
The
and the
Germans were
Norwegian.
the old ALC, which is my heritage and which is what my dad was a part of. At that point, there was Seminary Columbus and Wartburg. When in 60, with that merger, Luther Seminary became part. But Luther was a whole different ball of wax. And Wartburg and Columbus were very similar. And they were both part of the old ALC. So when it came time to say what districts we wanted to go to, I put North Pacific, South Pacific, Rocky Mountain. And I said, Bishops, come on, figure it out. So, and I got assigned to the Rocky Mountain,
What state?
Montana.
Okay.
My first call was to Red Lodge, Montana.
What was that like?
Well, it was a small town, which was a good thing. I grew up in small town, but it was a town that hosted a lot of visitors. In the summertime, it was one of the pathways to go to Yellowstone National Park. In the wintertime, it was a ski resort. So I had a number of people that had motels in that town. But it was an old mining town, and there were a lot of Finnish people there. And so I was trying to figure out how to connect with the Finns. But I kept saying, I can do this. I can do that. And I did. I mean, I saw my dad. I saw what he did. I knew how to do that. So I'm pretty sure I followed a lot of my dad's patterns when I got to seminary. But I really connected well with, I had my buddies were at seminary, and we had a good relationship with the professors. They were very engaging with us, and so I felt very comfortable there. And my sister is 4 years younger than I am, and she went to Capital, so and that she's my only sibling. So I had sort of had family in those years at Capital as well. So it was, did I ever feel that I really had a call to be a pastor? Sort of, but not really. Church was an integral part of my life. And part of the difficulty too was I'm in small town Oak Harbor. Oak Harbor is a town of about 2,500. Membership at St. John's in Oak Harbor was about 2,000. But that was with a lot of the rural farmers that were part of the congregation. So I was the preacher's kid in this small town. I was an athlete, and the conflict that I had, big conflict that I had with my dad was when I was a freshman in high school, and my dad said, "You will not play football." Well, Ohio, football's king. And in small town Ohio, football was really king. And so I would go to the locker room because I played basketball, ran track, did well in those. But I had a friend of mine checked a couple of times. I would go into the locker room and it'd get quiet. That was really a negative. If these are the church people, the church guys, and I never once during high school ever got invited to any of the parties. And they had them, but the preacher's kid wasn't going to get invited. So I had this piece. I could do it, but I also had the experience of not really being accepted. So I had that dual conflict going on. But seminary was a good time. And then in my sophomore year, I met a girl at Capital that became
Sophomore year, college or seminary?
college. And she was a freshman. I was a sophomore. She became my girlfriend, ultimately became my wife. And so that kept me there also. She was going to school there. So it just made it easy. Most everything went easy. I didn't see any reason why not. And in fact, my friends were there, but the seminary was a really good experience. But I sort of was always looking. And as I said, my first call was in Montana, but I was only there. I was there just short of 2 years, and then I got the call to be the youth pastor at St. Matthew in Beaverton, Oregon. And the lead pastor was Ted Brickner. Well, Ted Brickner was also a graduate of the Seminary of Columbus. His dad was a graduate of the Seminary of Columbus. He grew up not too far from where I was in Michigan. So I went out to be his assistant at St. Matthew Beaverton. And while I was there was a psychologist from DSHS, I don't remember as well. But anyway, he put on a seminar for clergy on how to deal with alcohol and drug issues. And I went to that and I sat there and he did therapy right in front of us. And I sat there and I said, there it is. That's my calling. And so it took me 7 years, but I then became a psychotherapist. And I was a psychotherapist for 40 years. I think it was 11 years I was parish pastor, and I was in 3 parishes. My last parish was in northern Washington, right up near the Canadian border. But then I started the counseling program for Lutheran Social Services in 1975. And I became a very active part of the American Association of Pastoral Counselors, which is really about the integration of theology and psychology and counseling. And that's what I did for 40 years.
Wow, that's really cool that you were able to bring those interests together.
Yeah, it was. And it fit really well. My offices were always in churches, always in Lutheran churches, and it was a wonderful experience. And so it took a while, and it took a lot of patience to finally get there and not give up when it wasn't like I felt like I had a real hard and fast call to parish. But I think the call was really to people, to ministry, not necessarily parish. I did well in parish. My 5 years as a youth pastor in Beaverton were actually absolutely wonderful years. I was in a church that we had probably generally we would have over 120 kids in high school. So I would have youth groups usually of around 30 to 40 all the time, and I really loved that.
You mentioned you had the office for a lot of your psychology work in a church building. Do you think that allowed you to reach people who were able to benefit from working with psychologists that would not have walked into the office of a psychologist if it wasn't in a church?
Yes, very definitely. And also, one of the things that was also interesting were people who had absolutely no connection with the church, I had not a lot, but some who considered themselves atheists, but they were curious.
Mhm.
So that became a piece that also became part. But many of the people that I worked with were active church people. But then I also had a lot of people who may have been or grew up in the church, had gone away from the church, and to me, it was so much of therapy was dealing with their brokenness. And part of their brokenness was really being separated from the spiritual part of their life. And so it was really about working with integration a lot of the time. And I was in a place where we could talk about it freely. It wasn't about judgment at all, but they often found it comfortable to talk about some of those things.
Yeah, I think because of how much those two disciplines can work together, I can see how that would be really helpful to work with somebody that had a background in both of those things. Now, actually, I'm curious to that end. What I understand to be a newer term that I've heard thrown around is spiritual direction. Do you consider that to sort of be related to your work, or
Oh
even
yeah.
your work kind of laying the groundwork for that to come
Although
about
I
in the
never
formal field?
I never pursued becoming a spiritual director. That's very much connected with the integration of psychotherapy and spirituality.
I guess then how would you define what you did versus what spiritual direction did? I guess.
I think a lot of spiritual direction, as I understand it, I never saw a spirit, was never involved with it deeply, but I think it is a little more biblically related than mine was probably more psychologically related. I mean, like I needed to be licensed as a
Yeah,
mental health counselor. They weren't particularly interested in whether I had this spiritual background, but the licensure stuff, they were in terms of my psychological stuff. And I think spiritual direction probably is more theologically based than psychologically based,
gotcha.
but it integrates it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. So you were a psychologist that just so happened to have a pastoral background that you were able to lean on. But
Right.
that,
Well,
yeah,
part of becoming part of, and this doesn't exist anymore, was the American Association of pastoral counselors. That was a professional organization, and in order to become a member of that, you had to sit for exams and sit for interviews, and you had to demonstrate the ability to integrate the psychological and the spiritual.
I guess how many pastoral counselors were there? How common was that? And then why is that organization no longer around? Or is it still around in some form?
Well, it isn't. It doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It went out. Good questions. At one time, there was, well, I had two of the people that were on staff with me in Seattle had their doctorates in pastoral counseling from Boston. And so at one time, that was a discipline that existed. And at one time, I would say that there were probably five, 600 pastoral members of AAPC across the country,
Those
uh,
being all denominations.
across all denominations, including Jewish. What I think happened is over the years, that became less and less popular. Fewer people were becoming part of the organization. I think also as we experience much, much more of the political split countrywide, at one time, those who were, well, I would say, much more theologically conservative really pursued much more rather than the integration of the psychological and the theological, they went more and more to straight biblical counseling.
Gotcha.
And I think that led to a lot of the reason that the numbers declined
Hmm.
for AAPC. And I think AAPC now, I don't know how exactly when it died, but it was probably about 10, 15 years ago,
Hmm.
something like that. We then became very much related to Lutheran Social Services, which was much more the social workers, the social work types.
Do you think that something was lost, perhaps, though, in not having as much interface directly with the congregations, though?
Well, we began with Lutheran Social Services, but in 1981, there were 12 of us that left Lutheran Social Services and began Lutheran Counseling Network in the greater Seattle area. That organization still exists, and all of those offices are still in churches.
Hmm.
So, what it amounted to is our ELCA churches really have seen the value of that integration, and they provide space for counselors in their churches at no cost.
Very cool. And
So
is that a regional thing? It's mostly in
yes,
that part of the country.
yes, it is.
That's very cool. And yeah, that's one of the things I appreciate about having these conversations is getting to hear about different types of ministries that are going on in different places, and
Yes,
that's neat that that's
there's
going.
a lot of possibilities. Parish is not the only piece. It's an absolutely crucial piece. My wife and I are still very actively involved in our congregation here. I'm chair of the care team at our church. So, and I still go somewhat regularly to the tech study group, even though I retired. Well, I retired at age 80, but I still go to the tech study group. I find that interesting. And
Uh,
they appreciate that the parish pastors appreciate this because I tend to look at the texts in a little different way than most of them.
how so?
Well, I've got this whole psychological background that's also a part of it. They're going to look at that text primarily from a biblical theological perspective, and I look at it much more from a personal integrative perspective.
Yeah.
And that I think that they appreciate having somebody who looks at it some differently.
Yeah, and actually, the thing I was going to ask was just sort of touching on that. What was the relationship like when you were doing pastoral psychology out of a church? What was the relationship between you and the parish pastor like?
They were usually good friends.
Okay.
And the one church where I was, which was in Bellevue, Washington, suburban Seattle, I would go up there to get my mail to the office. If he was free, I would go sit down. We would have very good in-depth conversations. They were virtually always good friends. They often would ask me questions or ask for suggestions on how to deal with a or a parishioner that they may be having difficulty with, or one that was having difficulty, and how I would look at that. That was a very, very typical thing that happened with the pastors in the churches where my offices were.
Yeah. No, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, as somebody who doesn't necessarily see myself becoming a pastoral counselor, I understand how having even some level of psychological knowledge is essential to ministry because you have people that come in with all kinds of well, obviously there's psychological issues regarding grief and yeah,
Right.
these kind of things. And
See, I think most of the parish pastors that I know, if they were going to see somebody and do any kind of counseling, they would see them 2 or 3 times.
hmm,
And after the second or third time, they would refer them to me.
yeah. One other thing I wanted to follow up on, circling back, you mentioned you went out to Portland when you were in high school, and of course you stayed out in that area. What was it that made you fall in love with the West so much, the Northwest?
Well, first of all, it's absolutely beautiful. I was there in the middle of the summer, and from July to October, it is moderate temperature. Usually doesn't get that hot, and we have a lot of sunny days. It's very pleasant. You might get some snow. You might get 1 or 2 snowy days in the wintertime, but it usually doesn't. I mean, we can have winters where it doesn't get below freezing. And so it's moderate all year round. You sort of have 4 seasons, but you mostly don't. But you don't have the hot weather like you're going to have down in California. I mean, like right now, it's sunny and 70,
Beautiful.
and it'll get up to maybe 75 today. And for the most part, you've got pretty friendly people out here. Not that you don't in the Midwest, but most of the people, and particularly when I came on, well, many of them, they're from wherever. Or like me, my family was all back in the Midwest. You are really on the frontier with your family.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sure that gives you just a neat perspective. And you mentioned, how beautiful it is out there, and I'm sure you see God in that and all
Oh
the
yeah.
beauty of nature, and it sounds like you see God in people as well. You mentioned how much of a people person you are.
Well, that's see, my belief is God is there.
Hmm.
They may not be aware of it, but particularly part of function as a pastoral counselor, part of that task was to help them reestablish that connection, or they saw God as very judgmental and they dealt so much of the time with lots of guilt and depression. And it was really about helping them to experience God as a loving, caring God. And this became a significant part of my relationship with them, because it was not unusual. It was not unusual for me to work with people 2, 3 years, because I did a lot of in-depth, long-term therapy with people.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on, and
Okay.
I always like to end with a prayer. So if you
Thank you.
don't mind praying with me. God, just thank you for Pastor Shoup and the ministry that you've been able to do through him. Just help us to remember the value of our minds and how it relates to our body and our spirit, and the power being of service can have both to those who are already a part of your church and to those who are not yet part of your church. We just pray that this conversation might serve as a source of inspiration, perhaps for those who are conflicted between disciplines, and hope for those who are struggling with anything psychologically, that they may know that you are there and that help is out there. We pray all these things in your holy name. Amen. Thanks for listening to my interview with Reverend Paul Shoup. If you haven't already, remember to follow this show on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Mighty Fortress Is Our Pod is a production of Mighty Fortress Media. The views and opinions expressed are those of the guests and the host, and are not intended to represent the views and opinions of any Lutheran Church body. Be sure to follow this show on Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Thanks for listening.